I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The Smoky Mountains in mid-October promised the kind of colors that photographers dream of: amber, gold, crimson, and copper stretching across ridges and valleys, curling up into mist that clung to the peaks like smoke. I wasn't alone in my excitement. 3 of my friends, Sam, Jordan, and Claire, shared the same anticipation, cameras slung over shoulders, backpacks loaded with snacks, water, and extra layers. We left the small parking lot at 9 in the morning, the air crisp and fragrant with wet leaves and pine sap, the fog thin and shifting over the distant ridges. The trail was well marked, at least at first, and the gentle crunch of fallen leaves underfoot set a rhythm as we walked. Every so often, a squirrel would dart across our path, disappearing into the underbrush, and the occasional crow called from high branches, their voices echoing through the early mist. The first few miles were calm and almost meditative. We paused often to photograph the trees, the way sunlight filtered through golden leaves and the mist that rolled over the higher ridges. Claire found a small stream and knelt at the edge, capturing its reflection with perfect stillness. Jordan wandered a few feet ahead, his camera focused on a patch of red maples illuminated by a sudden sunbeam. I stayed behind slightly, taking in the vastness of the valley below, the fog beginning to thicken in pockets but not enough to obscure the trail. The quiet was almost tangible. The sound of our breathing and the soft rustle of leaves were the only interruptions. By early afternoon, the fog had grown denser. It curled around trunks and rocks, swirled in the underbrush, and hid the distant ridges we had been photographing just minutes before. The air became cooler, damp against our skin, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. We didn't notice at first, distracted by the colors and textures of the forest, but somewhere around the 6th mile, the trail started to feel wrong. Familiar bends didn't appear where they should, and small landmarks we had passed on the way up seemed to vanish, replaced by terrain that looked similar but not quite right. The GPS on my phone wavered, spinning and recalculating, as if the signal couldn't find our location. Anxiety started to creep in, subtle at first, then building as we realized we might have taken a wrong turn. The moment that pushed my heart into my throat came just before 4 in the afternoon. The fog had become a thick wall, reducing visibility to 10 feet or less. That's when I noticed movement, or rather, a stillness that felt like movement. Just at the edge of the fog, I swore I saw a figure. It was standing upright, completely motionless, watching us. I stopped dead, my camera hanging uselessly from my neck, the hairs on my arms standing up. I tried to wave to get its attention, and Sam pointed in the direction too, joking that it was probably a hunter. But the footprints we saw a few steps behind the figure, huge, wide, and irregular, unlike anything human, made it impossible to dismiss. The figure didn't respond. It didn't shift or move. It just watched. The fog hid most details, but the sheer size was unmistakable. It wasn't wearing any recognizable clothing, and there was a rigidness to its posture that made it almost unnatural in proportion. We pressed on cautiously, retracing what we thought was our route, but the trail seemed to warp in the fog. Every tree, every boulder looked familiar and alien at the same time. The leaves, once crisp and golden, now appeared darker, almost wet with shadow, though no rain had fallen. Small sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, echoed in the fog, amplified, and each one made my pulse jump. The temperature dropped as the afternoon turned into evening. My fingers stiffened around the straps of my backpack, my breathing quickened, and my eyes darted between the fog and the faint outlines of the trail. By 6 o'clock, the fog thinned slightly, revealing more of the landscape. Relief was short-lived. We found ourselves back on a trail, but it was not the one we had started on. The switchbacks and ridges were wrong, the vegetation unfamiliar. Panic was muted but persistent. Each step forward felt cautious, measured. We stopped often to double-check the GPS, which had finally stabilized, guiding us along a route that would eventually take us out. The trail meandered down a gentle slope, the sunlight fading behind the peaks, casting long, eerie shadows through the thinning fog. Every time I thought I could see the figure again, it was gone, and yet the memory of it stayed with me, a knot in my stomach that refused to loosen. Our pace increased, more from instinct than strategy, the silence between us thick with tension. I could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down, the uncertainty of whether the forest was simply deceptive or if there was something more, something large and unaccounted for, out there. The trail wound down through old oaks and maples, their branches scraping against each other in the rising wind. A faint smell of smoke from a distant fire drifted in, or maybe it was just the dampness and decay. The last mile felt endless. My legs burned, my lungs ached, and the adrenaline kept me alert to every sound and movement. By 7:30, we emerged from the fog and the dense forest onto a wider trail that led toward the parking lot. The lights of cars flickered through the trees, and the sight of other hikers in the distance brought an overwhelming sense of relief. We were exhausted, wet from the fog that had soaked our jackets, and tense from hours of uncertainty. We didn't speak of the figure that had watched us, the footprints, or the strange way the forest seemed to twist around us. The memory was too sharp, too real, and we all felt the unspoken agreement that some things were better left unsaid. Driving down the mountain, the fog behind us rolled over the peaks like a gray river, swallowing the trails we had crossed. I glanced at my friends in the back seat. Their expressions mirrored my own, silent, wary, and unsettled. None of us knew exactly what we had seen, whether it was a person, some kind of unusual animal, or just a trick of the fog and light. But the size of the footprints and the stillness of the figure left no easy explanation. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a hallucination. It was something large, watching, and for a moment, it controlled the forest, controlling the fear that clung to us long after we had left it behind. By the time we reached the highway, the sun had set completely. The warmth of the car, the familiar hum of tires on asphalt, and the lights of nearby towns were comforting, but the unease lingered. It wasn't the fear of being lost that stayed with me. It was the knowledge that we had been observed, measured in a way we could not understand, and that the forest could hide shapes and sizes beyond what we were prepared for. Later, when I reviewed the photos we had taken that day, none showed the figure. The mist had swallowed it completely, and yet, in my mind, in the memory of that day, it was as clear as the autumn sky. Still, silent, enormous, and watching. We never spoke about it after that day, but the image returned in quiet moments. When I drove at night, when I walked through the woods alone, when the fog rolled in over the ridges. The trip had been beautiful, filled with color and light, but it had also been a reminder of how little we understand the forest we admire. The Smoky Mountains had shown us something wild and patient, something that waited at the edge of sight. And in the end, getting out alive without a scratch felt like the only victory we could claim. The figure remained a question, unsolved, yet undeniable, a presence as real as the crisp October air that had filled our lungs all day. I left the trailhead at 6:30 in the morning, the air sharp with the kind of cold that only comes from high altitude. The Baretooth Mountains stretched before me in jagged lines of granite, sprinkled with patches of snow even though it was late summer. I carried only a backpack, my tent, and a GPS, deliberately keeping my pack light. This was my first serious solo overnight hike, and I wanted the challenge of relying entirely on myself. The first hours were easy, at least in the sense that my body moved smoothly over the trail. The sun was low and golden, illuminating wildflowers clinging to the rocks and patches of green that seemed impossibly bright against the gray cliffs. Birds called somewhere far below, and the wind whispered through pines, cutting through the quiet like a knife. I felt completely alive in that emptiness, the way you do when the world narrows down to the rhythm of your own steps. The morning passed in a steady climb. Loose rocks shifted under my boots, and the air thinned, tugging at my lungs with each step. By noon, I had reached a small plateau and paused to rest. I sat on a flat boulder and ate a simple lunch of trail mix and jerky, scanning the valleys below. Everything seemed vast and permanent, the kind of silence that wraps around you and refuses to let go. I refilled my water from a tiny stream trickling through the rocks. The water was icy and clear, and I drank greedily, feeling my body respond almost immediately to the cold shock. There was a faint smell of pine resin and wet earth in the air, and I breathed it in, tasting the mountains with every inhale. By mid-afternoon, I had left the main trail, following a narrower path that my GPS indicated would lead to a ridge with a suitable campsite. The incline grew steeper, the path narrower, and loose stones slid under my weight. I reminded myself constantly to place each foot carefully. The sun had risen high and the heat was noticeable even at this elevation, though the wind kept it from being oppressive. I spotted a few marmots darting among rocks, and I paused to watch them, fascinated by their fearless energy, the kind of small life that exists entirely apart from humans. Around 8:45 in the evening, I finally found a flat spot near the edge of a ridge to set up camp. The view was extraordinary. Below me, the valley stretched in a mosaic of green and gold, fading into shadow as the sun dropped behind distant peaks. I pitched my tent with methodical care, anchoring each pole and staking the corners securely. The sound of the wind through the pines carried down the slope, rhythmic and steady. I lay in my tent for a moment, listening to the subtle noises of the mountains. The rustle of leaves, the distant clatter of rocks rolling down slopes I couldn't see, the occasional call of an unseen bird. Everything seemed in order, perfectly normal. I opened my pack to check my supplies, then looked out toward the treeline below. Movement caught my eye almost immediately. A figure had emerged among the shadows of the trees. At first I thought it was a deer. The shape was vague, swaying slightly as if grazing. Then it shifted, standing upright. I froze. The figure was impossibly tall, far taller than any human I expected to see in this area, and it remained at the treeline, watching me. My rational mind argued it was a trick of light, a shadow cast by a leaning tree, a rock formation. But my gut felt tight and cold, a warning that I couldn't ignore. I raised my flashlight, sweeping the beam slowly across the slope. Each time I thought I had a clear sight of it, it ducked behind a tree, vanishing into darkness. I held my breath and waited, heart hammering, but nothing moved. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing. I tried to reason through what I knew. Bears could stand on hind legs, though rarely for long. Elk could be enormous. Shadows were deceptive in the low light. Still, the figure remained just at the edge of visibility, always returning to the same spot. Couldn't sleep. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I kept my knife within reach, laying it beside my sleeping pad, though I dreaded the thought of opening the tent flap to check. Hours passed slowly. The wind picked up, whistling along the ridge, carrying with it the cold that seeped through my layers. At 3 a.m., the silence broke with the sharp snap of a branch near my tent. My tent poles shivered under the disturbance, and my stomach dropped. I pressed myself flat against my sleeping bag, holding my breath, waiting for some repeat, some indication that it was just an animal. Nothing followed. I stayed awake until first light, listening to every sound, noting every shadow, unable to relax even as the sky began to lighten with the soft blue of morning. When the sun finally crested the mountains, I packed up quickly, moving with a speed that bordered on panic. My eyes darted constantly to the treeline below, half expecting the tall figure to emerge again. I forced myself to follow the trail downhill, careful with each step on the loose gravel. The valley gradually widened, and familiar landmarks appeared as I retraced the route toward the trailhead. My legs ached from the constant tension, my hands raw from gripping poles and zippers, my mind replaying every movement from the night before. It wasn't until I reached a clearing just before the end of the trail that I looked back over my shoulder. My breath caught. In the soft soil near my campsite, enormous footprints were pressed into the ground. The prints were far too large to be a bear or any ordinary animal in the area. They were spaced in a way that suggested long legs, and the depth of the impressions indicated significant weight. I stared at them, stomach tight, heart still pounding, tracing each outline with my eyes. My rational mind tried to convince me that erosion, rocks shifting, or some illusion caused by shadows could explain it. But the size, the clarity, and the proximity to the ridge left little room for doubt. Something had been there, something I hadn't been able to see clearly, and I had spent the night directly in its vicinity. I didn't look back again as I walked the final stretch to my car. The forest behind me seemed ordinary now, the treelines solid and silent. But I carried a new awareness of the scale of wilderness, the kind that humbles you completely. Something massive, capable, and deliberate had been watching me. I had survived, yes, but the memory of the ridge, the figure at the treeline, and the enormous footprints stayed with me in a way no trail map, gear list, or safety tip could have prepared me for. That day, I realized that solitude in the mountains is not just about being alone. It is about being observed by the raw, unfiltered presence of the world around you, in ways you cannot always explain. And in that realization, I found a respect and a caution that I carry with me every time I return to the wilderness. I set out in the late afternoon, the sun still high over the Nevada desert, carrying only my backpack, tent, water, and essentials for a solo overnight hike. My goal was simple: to escape the city, to camp under the stars, and to immerse myself in the quiet vastness of the desert. The air was dry, carrying the faint scent of creosote and dust, and the ground beneath my boots was a mixture of sand and jagged rocks. Heat radiated off the stones, even though the late afternoon sun was beginning its descent. I moved steadily, careful with every step, aware of loose rocks and cactus spines hidden among the scrub. The desert stretched out in every direction, wide and open, but the isolation carried a weight of its own. There were no sounds of civilization, only the occasional rustle of dry brush in the wind and the distant cry of a bird circling the ridges. By early evening, I had reached a small clearing framed by clusters of cholla and prickly pear cacti. The location was perfect for camping, flat and slightly sheltered from the wind. I pitched my tent, taking care to clear the ground of sharp stones and debris, and arranged my supplies in a circle within reach. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains. Shadows stretched long and dark, settling into the hollows and ridges around me. The air smelled cooler, cleaner, but the quiet was more pronounced, almost oppressive. I cooked a small meal over my stove, the scent of heated food mixing with the dry, dusty smell of the desert. After eating, I cleaned up and settled into my sleeping bag, hoping for a peaceful night under the stars. Around 9 p.m., I noticed something unusual. Deep in the brush near the edge of the clearing, I saw small glowing reflections. At first, I assumed they were eyes of deer or some other nocturnal animal. I froze, trying to catch movement, but the lights stayed in place, arranged in a loose line. Then one blinked, followed by another, in a sequence that made me pause. They weren't random. They seemed deliberate, almost like they were watching me. My first reaction was disbelief. It was probably an animal reflecting the moonlight, or maybe distant headlights caught in the sand, but the pattern didn't make sense. My stomach tightened, a low, persistent tension spreading through me. I continued setting up my tent, deliberately moving slowly, trying to convince myself I hadn't noticed anything unusual. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the dry brush made me freeze, listening for any further signs of movement. Hours passed with minimal change. The lights remained in the distance, occasionally blinking, always fixed in that same general area. I tried to reason through what I was seeing. Coyotes, owls, or rabbits. Nothing made complete sense. I double-checked my surroundings, scanning the sparse terrain with my flashlight, noting the cacti and rocks, the shallow dips and ridges in the sand, any potential hiding place. The desert seemed more alive than I had anticipated, every shadow exaggerated in the dim light. I forced myself to stay calm, adjusting my sleeping bag and checking my pack, but my mind kept returning to the lights, blinking slowly, deliberately. Around 2 a.m., the tension peaked. I thought I saw movement between the cacti. Something shifted, tall and broad, larger than any human I could imagine navigating the brush so quietly. I froze, stomach knotting, flashlight shaking slightly in my hands. The shape seemed to linger, then retreat slightly, but always within the same area, just beyond the clearing. I tried to rationalize it must be a coyote, a bobcat, a desert fox. But the size, the way it moved, suggested otherwise. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every sound, every subtle shift in the desert around me. The wind moved through the cacti, carrying faint, dry rattles. A distant rock shifted. Tiny animals scurried unseen. Yet the image of that broad silhouette persisted in my mind, impossible to ignore. When the first light of dawn touched the ridges, I moved cautiously, checking the area around my tent and scanning the brush where I had seen the figure. The desert now seemed ordinary in the bright morning light. Beige sand, greenish-gray cacti, pale scrubs scattered over the rocky terrain. Nothing moved, nothing signaled the night's tension. I packed my gear with deliberate care, keeping my eyes on the surroundings, ears alert to even the smallest sounds. As I stepped away from the clearing, I spotted a footprint pressed into the sand near where I had camped. It was large, far too big for any known desert animal, and the shape suggested something heavier and broader than a human. I knelt to examine it, comparing it to my boots. The depth of the impression indicated significant weight, far beyond what I could attribute to a coyote or fox. I studied it, tracing the edges with my fingers, noting the ridges of the sand pressed beneath it. There was nothing else, no second print, no trail leading away, just the single, unmistakable mark. My stomach tightened. I left the footprint behind, moving carefully back along the trail I had used to reach the clearing, constantly scanning the brush and ridges, half expecting to see the figure again. By mid-morning, I had returned to the main road, the sounds of distant traffic faint but comforting. My legs were sore, muscles tense from the night of vigilance and fear. Every step on pavement felt alien compared to the soft, shifting sand and jagged rocks of the desert. I looked back once at the desert horizon, at the ridges and brush that had felt so vast and alive, and the memory of blinking lights and the tall, broad movement stayed with me. I reminded myself that the desert is unpredictable, that shadows and shapes can distort perception, and that sometimes even experienced hikers misinterpret natural signs. But the footprint remained undeniable, tangible evidence of something large I could not identify. The hike left a lasting impression. I continued to return to the desert, but I approached it differently afterward. I learned to set up camp with more awareness, to monitor surrounding terrain, and to respect the quiet weight of the night. I kept mental notes of every sound, every shape, and every subtle anomaly. I no longer assumed that solitude meant safety or that shadows were harmless. The desert is expansive and isolating, and even the most familiar landscapes can become disorienting when night falls. That night under the stars taught me that vigilance is essential, that the unknown can be subtle and deliberate, and that sometimes the smallest details, a blink of light, a movement between cacti, a single footprint, can dominate the memory of an entire trip. I left Nevada with both awe and caution, carrying the desert's lessons forward in every hike I take, aware that solitude in the wilderness comes with responsibility, and that awareness is the only protection against the unpredictable. I had been avoiding the mountains for months, the memory of my failed relationship lingering like a weight on my chest. Finally, one October morning, I decided to hike alone, to let the cold air and endless ridges clear my head. I left the trailhead at 5, the sky still dark, streaked with the faintest light of dawn, carrying my pack with water, food, and a camera I barely remembered how to use. The Cloud's Rest route was demanding, known for its sharp climbs and long stretches exposed to the wind, but I wanted the solitude, the kind of quiet only the high Sierra could offer. The first few miles were calm, the soft crunch of my boots on dirt and scattered granite the only sound beyond the distant rush of a river far below. Mist lingered over the valleys, clinging to the pines like silk, and the air was sharp, almost biting as it filled my lungs with each breath. By mid-morning, the sun had risen fully, spilling warm light across the ridges and painting the granite in shades of pink and gold. That's when I saw him. A man coming the other way, moving steadily, his pack large and worn. He was older, gray at the temples, shoulders stooped slightly beneath the weight of his load. We exchanged the briefest nods, the kind hikers use to acknowledge each other without interrupting the rhythm of a climb. There was nothing overtly wrong, but something about him made my skin tighten. He didn't meet my eyes, and when I tried to observe the straps of his pack, the color of his jacket, the detail that might indicate his route, he seemed unwilling to offer anything. He moved off before I could think too much about it, and I carried on, shrugging off the unease as fatigue and the morning's cold. The climb became steep around 10 o'clock. My legs burned with effort, but I welcomed it. The focus required to place each foot safely on the granite enough to keep my mind from wandering to the breakup, to the conversations I should have had, the words I wished I hadn't said. Wind swept across the ridge, biting through my jacket, scattering loose leaves and dust. The trail narrowed in places, sheer drops appearing suddenly on one side, and the solitude deepened. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through rocks and the occasional caw of a distant bird. Around noon, as I paused to catch my breath on a bend, I heard it. My name, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind from behind. My heart jumped. I looked down the slope, scanning the trail, but there was no one. I stood frozen for a long moment, listening, the echo of the name lingering. My mind raced through possibilities. A friend on another trail, some odd trick of the wind. I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence, and pressed on, more aware now of the sound of every footfall, every rock shifting under my boots. Half an hour later, as I rounded a bend above a cluster of pines, I froze again. His pack sat there, neatly placed on a flat stretch of granite, the straps tucked under and the water bottle still clipped in the side pocket. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned rocks or footprints leading off the trail, nothing to suggest an accident. It was as if he had set it down and simply disappeared. The careful placement, the absence of disorder, unsettled me more than fear itself. I scanned the ridge up and down the trail, the steep drops and the wind-swept granite, but there was no trace of him. My stomach sank, the adrenaline rising sharply, the wind suddenly colder, harsher against my exposed skin. I left the pack where it was, marking the exact spot on my GPS before continuing carefully, descending slowly to a wider stretch of trail that would eventually meet a loop back toward the parking area. Every step felt tentative, each bend a potential surprise. The solitude I had sought now pressed in on me, making every shadow, every ridge, feel magnified. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see him emerge from behind a tree or around a corner, but the trail remained empty. By late afternoon, I reached the main loop and spotted another hiker in the distance, the sight bringing a surprising relief. I told the ranger what had happened, describing the man, his pack, the placement on the trail, and the odd absence of footprints. They noted it, promised to check the area, but days later, nothing was ever found. There were no missing person reports that fit his description, no trace beyond the pack. They suggested he might have left the trail to rest or had gotten help from someone elsewhere, but the neatness of the abandoned gear and the lack of evidence of him leaving in any conventional way left me unsettled. The memory of that day lingered longer than any bruise or ache from the climb. On subsequent hikes, I found myself scanning ridges, listening to the echo of my name, noticing every out-of-place stick, every shadow that seemed too deliberate. The fear wasn't dramatic, not the sort that leaves a lasting panic, but a quiet, insistent awareness that the world can contain anomalies, people whose actions can't be explained, who vanish without a trace. I replayed the route over and over, tracing the bends, imagining his steps, and trying to find some logic in his disappearance. But there was none. Even months later, I can recall the weight of the air that day, thick and clean at the same time, the way the wind cut through my jacket on the ridge, the scent of granite warmed by sunlight, the silence beyond the occasional bird, the careful placement of the pack, the fleeting sound of my name carried on the wind. All these details remained vivid, lodged in my memory. Hiking, which had been an escape, a form of therapy, now carried an edge of caution. I learned to be hyper-aware of my surroundings, to trust instincts that I might previously have ignored. The pack itself stayed in my mind for weeks, a small, almost mundane object that marked the presence and sudden absence of someone I would never see again. It was a reminder that the mountains are not just beautiful. They are vast, indifferent, and can conceal far more than they reveal. The image of him, older, stooped under the weight of his pack, eyes averted, still haunts me. But it is the abandonment, the deliberate neatness of the gear, that unsettles me most. It is proof that not everything that disappears leaves a mess. Not every absence has an explanation. When I hike now, I take extra precautions, studying maps, letting friends know my route, carrying more supplies, even though I always prefer solitude. I think about him on steep ridges, in the folds of the mist that gathers in early morning, and I remember that some people vanish without trace, leaving only questions, small markers of their presence that become larger in the mind with each retelling. The mountains taught me to respect the unknown, to understand that the world holds gaps in its logic, and that sometimes the clearest memory is of something that happened silently, without a single hint of struggle or disorder, but that leaves a mark that never fades. Even now, when I step onto a trail alone, my pace measured, my eyes alert, I carry that memory with me, knowing the truth of that day. The man never returned, the pack never moved, and the mountains kept their secret. I have reconciled with that, not with understanding, but with acceptance. The ridge, the trail, the wind, all are as they were. The anomaly exists only in memory, but it is enough to remind me that the world is wider and stranger than our habits and expectations account for. That day changed the way I hike, the way I notice, and the way I carry solitude. It is a story without resolution, but one that ended with my safe return, my awareness sharpened, and a respect for the unpredictability of the wilderness that I would never forget. I left the trailhead early in the morning, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and moss. Olympic National Park was exactly what I had hoped for. A dense, unbroken rainforest where the city felt impossibly distant. My pack was heavy with the essentials: tent, stove, food for the week, and water. I wanted to push myself to spend days on end navigating the forest without interruption, and the solitude was exactly what I needed. The first 2 days passed in a blur of green. Every step was accompanied by the constant drizzle that the rainforest is known for, the rain settling on my jacket, soaking my boots, and running down my neck. Streams crossed my path constantly, and I had to gauge each crossing carefully, placing my weight precisely on slick rocks to avoid slipping. The forest was alive with sounds: distant waterfalls, the occasional call of a raven, and the unending, soft patter of rain on leaves. By the third day, I was following a narrow trail that wound steeply up a ridge. The light was dim, filtered through the thick canopy above. The rain had lessened to a persistent drizzle, leaving the undergrowth damp and slick. My boots squelched against the mud with every step, and the smell of decaying leaves and pine resin filled my nose. I had just crossed a small creek when I noticed something on the map, an icon marking a structure. Curious, I pressed forward, keeping my pace slow, careful not to disturb the thin layer of leaves covering the roots and rocks. Eventually, I stumbled across a small, crumbling cabin tucked into a hollow in the forest. It was partially hidden by ferns and moss, walls gray and warped, the roof sagging in several places. The map had marked it as private property, but it was clearly abandoned. I circled the cabin, examining it carefully. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly off its hinges. I peeked inside. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture was old, decayed, as if it had been left to rot decades ago. A wooden table leaned to one side, drawers half open, the floor littered with leaves and bits of plaster. The air was stale, carrying the faint metallic smell of rust and wet wood. A thin layer of light filtering through the broken roof cast long, sharp shadows across the floor. I moved in cautiously, taking careful steps to avoid stepping on anything that might collapse under me. It was completely silent, apart from the faint rustle of the trees outside. I examined the walls, noticing faint scratches and stains, the kind of wear that comes from years of neglect. Everything about it felt stagnant, frozen in time, yet something about the stillness made my stomach tighten. I decided to camp nearby for the night. I found a small clearing not far from the cabin, level enough to pitch my tent without risking sliding down the muddy slope. I set up quickly, my hands numb from the cold and damp, and laid out my sleeping pad. The drizzle had stopped, leaving a wet chill that clung to my clothes. I cooked a small meal, the smell of heated beans and rice mixing with the earthy scent of the forest. By the time I crawled into my tent, the forest had quieted into the subtle, persistent sounds of nocturnal life. The distant drip of water, the soft rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of a small branch. I tried to relax, reading my map by flashlight for a few minutes, tracing the path I would follow the next day, and listening to the forest settle around me. Around 2:30 in the morning, I woke abruptly. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was a low, rasping whisper, and my heart started pounding immediately. I stayed perfectly still, straining my ears. The sound was unmistakable. It was forming words, slow and deliberate, the syllables barely audible but clear enough. Leave. My body reacted instantly, adrenaline flooding through me, my fingers gripping the edge of my sleeping bag. I forced myself to calm down, reasoning that the forest was full of strange sounds at night. Trees groan, water runs, branches break. Perhaps it was just an animal moving close enough to make the sound seem human. Still, my eyes kept flicking toward the cabin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed awake the rest of the night. Every creak, every distant splash of water, every whispering rustle set my nerves on edge. I checked my knife and flashlight, making sure they were within reach, and lay flat, listening to the rain and the shadows. The cabin seemed to shift in the darkness, the broken windows and leaning walls taking on shapes in my mind. I convinced myself to focus on the trail I had taken to get there, replaying each step in my head. I traced the path in reverse, imagining the movement of my feet over roots and rocks, trying to anchor myself in reality. The whispers never returned, but the tension lingered, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it impossible to sleep. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent cautiously. The forest was quiet, the rain replaced by a thin mist that clung to the trees. I moved toward the cabin, heart still racing, and noticed the door had swung open wider than I remembered. I had no memory of touching it. I approached slowly, examining the hinges and latch, convinced I must have left it ajar, but everything suggested it had been moved with force. A subtle indentation in the dirt near the door suggested that someone, or something, had been there recently. My stomach tightened, and I knew I wasn't safe lingering in that area. I packed up my gear with deliberate speed, checking the map constantly, making sure I would avoid the cabin entirely. I followed the trail downhill, my eyes darting to the trees constantly, scanning for any signs of movement. The forest seemed normal again, the mist softening the outlines of trees and rocks, yet I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I reached the main trail by late morning, stopping only to rest and catch my breath. My boots squelched with the remaining moisture, my muscles sore from tension and constant movement, and my pack felt heavier than it had for days. I didn't take breaks near the creek or the ferns, sticking rigidly to the trail until I reached the trailhead. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see the cabin or some sign of the disturbance, but it remained obscured by distance and trees. My pulse finally began to settle only when I was out of the forest and back in open light, the sounds of civilization faintly audible in the distance. The memory of the whispers, the cabin, and the door left ajar stayed with me long after I returned home. The forest was as beautiful and serene as it had been, but now I carried a heightened awareness of its unpredictability. The sense of something deliberate and unknown, moving unseen, made me approach the wilderness differently afterward. I learned to respect the quiet weight of the forest, the way it can hold its secrets tightly and make solitude feel more intense than I had ever imagined. My trip had been meant to be an escape, a chance to reconnect with nature, but it had also been a reminder of how small and vulnerable a person can feel when confronted with the unexpected. From that day on, I mapped my routes carefully, avoided abandoned structures, and listened to every subtle sound in the woods, aware that sometimes the forest doesn't need to be violent to make you feel completely exposed.